Three Mafia bosses thought they could never have children, until their Omega started getting morning sickness. The first wave of nausea hit Elias while he was still half asleep, curled in the center of a bed far too large for one man. He barely made it to the bathroom, bare feet slapping against heated marble before he collapsed in front of the toilet and emptied his stomach into the porcelain bowl. He gasped, forehead pressed against the cool rim. His hands trembled where they gripped the seat. The bathroom spun in slow, nauseating circles. Food poisoning, he told himself. Too much wine last night. But he hadn't drunk any wine. The three men who owned him, who loved him, he corrected himself, never let him touch alcohol. They said it wasn't good for an Omega. They said a lot of things, most of them wrapped in velvet commands and gentle threats. Elias dry heaved again, his stomach clenching around nothing. He stayed there until the shaking stopped, then forced himself to stand. The face in the mirror was pale, gray-eyed, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by sweat. He looked fragile. He hated looking fragile. Downstairs, the mansion was already alive with the quiet efficiency of men who worked for monsters. Elias made it to the kitchen before the second wave hit. He grabbed the edge of the marble island, knuckles white, and breathed through his nose until the room stopped tilting. Mr. Elias. Elias looked up. Hale stood in the doorway, silver-haired and unreadable. He had been the household manager for 20 years, and he had never once raised his voice. That calm, more than anything, made him terrifying. "I'm fine," Elias said. "You are not fine. You are pale, your pupils are dilated, and you are gripping that counter as though it might save your life." Hale stepped closer. "Shall I call Dr. Chen?" No, the word came out too sharp. Elias softened his tone. "It's just a stomach bug. Give me an hour." But Hale was already reaching for his phone. "The masters left instructions that any change in your health must be reported immediately." The masters, Elias hated that phrase. Dante, Luca, Matteo, they were his lovers, his alphas, the men who had marked him and made him theirs. But they were also the three most dangerous men on the East Coast, and everyone in this house deferred to them like gods. Elias surrendered. He let Hale help him to the sitting room, where he sank into a leather armchair and closed his eyes. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, a compact man with kind eyes and a bag full of diagnostic equipment. The examination was quick and professional. Blood pressure. Temperature. Questions about his symptoms. When was his last heat? Was he experiencing any pain? Had he noticed any changes in his appetite? Elias answered truthfully, too tired to be embarrassed. Then Dr. Chen took out a small white device. "I'd like to run a blood test. It will only take a minute." Elias watched the doctor prick his finger and press a drop of blood onto a test strip. The machine beeped. Dr. Chen glanced at the screen, then went very still. "What?" Elias demanded. The doctor didn't answer. He ran the test again. The machine beeped a second time. "Dr. Chen." "I need to call Mr. Vitali," the doctor said quietly. Elias's stomach dropped. "Why? What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." Dr. Chen met his eyes, and there was something like awe in his expression. "But this is not an illness, Elias. You're pregnant." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Elias felt the floor vanish beneath him. "That's impossible. The test is positive. HCG levels are elevated. You're likely 6 or 7 weeks along." Dr. Chen stood, already reaching for his phone. "I have to inform the alphas." "Wait." Elias grabbed his wrist. His fingers were cold. "Please. Let me tell them myself." The doctor hesitated. "You know I can't do that. Their orders are absolute." "Then at least give me an hour. Just 1 hour. Let me figure out how to say it." Dr. Chen pulled his hand free, not unkindly. "I'm sorry, Elias. But this is above my pay grade. He walked out of the room, phone already pressed to his ear. Elias sat alone in the leather chair, one hand pressed to his flat stomach. The baby. A child. Something he had never allowed himself to want, because the three alphas had told him they could never have children. But if they could never have children, then how? No. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. He hadn't been with anyone else. He hadn't touched another man since Dante, Luca, and Matteo had claimed him. The thought was absurd. They were his world. His everything. He would rather die than betray them. But the alphas didn't know that. And when Dr. Chen called them, they would come home with blood in their eyes and fire in their hearts. Elias stood. His legs held. He walked to the window and watched the iron gates swing open. 20 miles away, in the heart of New York City, 3 phones were ringing with news that would tear their world apart. Dante Vitale was mid-sentence when his phone buzzed. He ignored it. He was staring down at a man tied to a chair in a warehouse in Brooklyn, a man who had been skimming money from Vitale family operations for the past 6 months. You understand your mistake now? Dante asked, his voice soft. You took from me. From my family. That is not something I can forgive. The man sobbed. His face was a ruin of blood and tears. I'll pay it back. I swear. Every cent. Just let me go. Dante smiled. It was a cold, thin smile that never reached his blue eyes. I don't want your money, Mr. Ferraro. I want your loyalty. And since you've proven you have none, I'll have to take something else. The phone buzzed again. And again. Dante pulled it out, annoyed. The caller ID read, Dr. Chen. Something cold slid down his spine. Dr. Chen only called when something was wrong with Elias. He answered without turning away from the bleeding man. Yes. Mr. Vitale. I'm at the estate. It's about Elias. Dante's heart stopped. Is he hurt? No, sir. He's pregnant. The word hit Dante like a bullet. He went completely still. On the other side of the room, his brothers Luca and Matteo were watching him, reading the change in his body language like wolves scenting blood. Say that again, Dante said, his voice dangerously quiet. Elias is pregnant. Approximately 6 to 7 weeks along. He's healthy, but he's experiencing morning sickness. I've recommended bed rest and prenatal vitamins. Dante's grip on the phone tightened until the screen creaked. Pregnant. Elias was pregnant. The Omega they had marked and claimed and kept had been carrying a child for 6 weeks. A child they had not fathered. Because they couldn't. They had known for 3 years that they were sterile. A biological weapon attack orchestrated by the Moretti family had stolen their ability to reproduce. Every doctor, every test, every painful confirmation had told them the same thing, they would never have children. So if Elias was pregnant, then Elias had been unfaithful. And that was unforgivable. We're on our way, Dante said, and hung up. He turned to his brothers. The man in the chair had stopped crying, sensing the shift in the room. Luca raised an eyebrow. Matteo cracked his knuckles. What is it? Luca asked. Dante's voice was ice. Elias is pregnant. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Luca laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. That's a joke, right? Tell me that's a joke. Do I look like I'm joking? Matteo stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the light. That's impossible. I know. Dante's eyes cut to the man in the chair. We'll deal with you later. He nodded to one of his soldiers. Keep him alive. I may need something to break. Then the 3 of them walked out of the warehouse and into the night. Elias heard the front door slam. The sound echoed through the mansion like a death knell. He had been sitting on the edge of the bed for the past hour, trying to prepare himself for what was coming. But when the footsteps thundered up the stairs, he realized he wasn't prepared at all. The bedroom door flew open. Dante stood in the doorway, tall and dark and utterly terrifying. His blue eyes were flat, empty. Behind him, Luca and Matteo filled the hall like shadows. "Get out," Dante said to the two guards who had been posted outside Elias's door. They vanished without a word. Elias stood. He kept his chin up, even though his hands were shaking. "I can explain." "Can you?" Dante stepped into the room. His movements were slow, controlled, like a predator stalking its prey. "Because from where I'm standing, there's only one explanation. And I don't think I want to hear it. I didn't cheat on you." Elias's voice broke on the word. "I would never. You know me." "Do we?" Luca slid into the room, his green eyes glittering with something dangerous. "Because apparently you've been hiding a pretty big secret, sweetheart. I didn't know I was pregnant until an hour ago. The doctor just told me. I swear." "And yet you're pregnant," Matteo said from the doorway. His voice was low, rough. "We're sterile, Elias. All three of us. So tell me, how does that work?" Elias's heart lurched. "What?" "We can't have children," Dante said. He was close now, close enough that Elias could smell his cologne, dark and smoky. "We've known for 3 years. A biological attack. We were told it was permanent. So if you're carrying a child, it can't be ours." The room spun. Elias grabbed the bedpost for support. You never told me that." "Why would we?" Luca spread his hands. "It wasn't exactly something we wanted to advertise. We couldn't give you children, so we gave you everything else. We thought that would be enough." "It is enough." Elias's voice cracked. "I don't need children. I just need you. But this baby is yours. I swear it on my life. I haven't touched anyone else." Dante's hand shot out and grabbed Elias by the jaw. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make his point. "Don't lie to me, Omega. I can smell it." Elias met his eyes, refusing to flinch. "I'm not lying. I've never lied to you. Not once. If there's a baby inside me, then one of you is not as sterile as you think." Dante's grip tightened. "You think this is a game? I think you're so desperate to find a betrayal that you're not even considering the obvious." Elias pulled his chin free, his gray eyes blazing. "Get a DNA test. Do it now. If that baby isn't yours, I'll walk out of this house and you'll never see me again. But if it is, you three are going to spend the rest of your lives making this up to me." The room went quiet. Luca blinked. Matteo shifted his weight. Dante stared at Elias like he was seeing him for the first time. "You're serious," Dante said slowly. "Dead serious." "The test can't be done until the pregnancy is further along," Luca said. "It's too risky this early." "Then we wait." Elias crossed his arms over his chest, trying to hide how badly he was shaking. "But I'll tell you right now, I'm not going to sit in this room like a prisoner while you decide whether or not to believe me. I'm still your Omega. And I'm pregnant. So unless you want me to lose this baby, your baby, you'd better start treating me like it." Dante's jaw tightened. For a long moment, Elias thought he might actually strike him. But then something shifted in those cold blue eyes. Not warmth, exactly. But hesitation. "Fine," Dante said at last. "We'll do the test when it's safe. But until then, you don't leave this house. You don't leave our sight. And if we find out you've been lying," he let the threat hang in the air. Elias held his ground. "I understand." Dante turned and walked out of the room. Luca followed, his green eyes lingering on Elias's face for a moment before he disappeared into the hall. Only Matteo remained, his massive body blocking the doorway. "You should eat something," Matteo said quietly. "The doctor said you need to keep your strength up." Elias let out a shaky breath. "I'm not hungry." "I don't care. I'll bring you soup." Matteo hesitated, then reached out and brushed his thumb across Elias's cheek. The touch was surprisingly gentle. I want to believe you, Elias. But this is hard. We've been through a lot. I know. Elias leaned into the touch, just for a second. But I'm telling the truth. And when the test proves it, I'm going to make all three of you beg. Matteo's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. I'd expect nothing less. He left, closing the door behind him. Elias stood alone in the massive bedroom, one hand pressed to his stomach, and wondered how his life had turned into such a beautiful, terrifying mess. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Elias was confined to the estate, as promised. The three alphas took turns watching him, their eyes following him from room to room like hawks. They didn't speak to him about the pregnancy. They didn't touch him. They barely looked at him unless they had to. It was the silence that hurt the most. Before, there had been warmth between them, gentle hands in his hair, lazy kisses on the couch, whispered promises in the dark. Now there was only distance, and distrust, and the cold, brittle fear that he had lost them forever. Elias spent most of his time in the library, curled up on the window seat with a book he wasn't reading. The morning sickness came and went, leaving him weak and miserable. He threw up twice a day. He couldn't keep down anything stronger than broth and dry toast. And every time he ran to the bathroom, he could feel their eyes on him, watching, judging. On the third day, Luca found him in the garden. Elias was sitting on a stone bench, wrapped in a thick wool coat, staring at the frozen roses. The November air was sharp and cold, but he didn't care. It felt good to be outside. You'll catch your death out here, Luca said, sitting down beside him. Maybe that would be easier. Luca's jaw tightened. Don't say that. Elias turned to look at him. Up close, Luca's green eyes were tired, shadowed. He hadn't been sleeping. None of them had. Why won't you believe me, Luca? What did I ever do to make you think I would do this? Luca was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, it's not about what you did. It's about what we can't do. We were told, no, we were guaranteed, that we could never have children. All three of us. The attack was meant to end the Vitali bloodline. And for 3 years, we've lived with that. We've accepted it. And now you're telling us we were wrong? Maybe you were. Elias reached out and placed a tentative hand on Luca's knee. Maybe the attack didn't work as well as the Moretti family thought. Maybe one of you has a chance after all. Luca covered Elias's hand with his own. His palm was warm, rough. And if it's not one of us? If the test comes back and the baby belongs to someone else? It won't. You can't know that. Elias looked him directly in the eyes. Yes, I can. Because there is no one else. There has never been anyone else. You three are the only men I've ever been with. The only men I've ever wanted. He squeezed Luca's knee. I know that doesn't prove anything. But it's the truth. Luca stared at him for a long time. Then, slowly, he lifted his free hand and brushed a strand of dark hair out of Elias's eyes. The gesture was so familiar, so achingly tender, that Elias felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. I want to believe you, Luca whispered. God, I want to. Then do. Just for now. Just until the test. Elias leaned into his touch. I need you, Luca. All of you. I can't do this alone. Luca pulled him into his arms, and for the first time in 3 days, Elias let himself cry. The fourth day brought an unexpected visitor, Dr. Marcus Reed, a genetic specialist who had worked with the Vitali family for years. He arrived at the estate in a black sedan, carrying a leather briefcase and a grim expression. Dante met him in the study, with Luca and Matteo flanking him on either side. Elias sat on the couch, his hands folded in his lap. He had been told to be present, but not to speak unless spoken to. I've reviewed Elias's medical records, Dr. Reed said, setting his briefcase on the desk. The pregnancy is confirmed. He's approximately 7 weeks along. The fetal heartbeat was detected this morning. Dante's expression didn't change. And I've also reviewed the test results from 3 years ago. The biological attack left all 3 of you with severe testicular damage. In most cases, that would result in permanent sterility. Dr. Reed paused. However, there are rare instances where the body repairs itself. Particularly in alphas with strong regenerative abilities. Luca leaned forward. So you're saying one of us might not be sterile anymore? I'm saying it's possible. Unlikely, but possible. Dr. Reed opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. I'd like to run a semen analysis on all 3 of you. It's non-invasive and will give us a clear answer. Dante nodded once. Do it. The tests were collected in private. Elias waited in the hall, pacing back and forth. The mansion felt like a tomb. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked. Somewhere else, a door opened and closed. 20 minutes later, Dr. Reed emerged from the study. His face was unreadable. Well? Dante demanded. 2 of you are still completely sterile, Dr. Reed said. But one of you is not. The room went still. Who? Luca asked. Dr. Reed looked down at his tablet. Dante. Your sperm count is low, but it's not 0. You are capable of fathering a child. Elias felt the world shift beneath him. He grabbed the wall for support. Dante was the father. Dante, the coldest and most controlled of the 3, the one who had looked at him with such icy suspicion, was the one who had put this baby inside him. Dante's face went pale. For the first time since Elias had known him, the alpha looked genuinely shaken. That's impossible. It's not. The attack damaged your reproductive system, but it didn't destroy it. Something, stress, hormones, time, has allowed a partial recovery. It's rare, but it happens. Dr. Reed met Dante's eyes. Congratulations, Mr. Vitali. You're going to be a father. The word hung in the air like a bomb. Luca let out a breath. Matteo ran a hand over his face. And Elias felt something inside him crack open. He had been right. The baby was Dante's. The baby was theirs. But before he could speak, Dante turned and walked out of the room. Elias found him in the garage, standing beside his black Lamborghini with his hands braced on the hood. His shoulders were rigid, his head bowed. He didn't look up when Elias approached. Dante. Don't. Elias ignored him. He walked around the car and stood in front of the Alpha, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on the metal. Dante, look at me. Slowly, Dante raised his head. His blue eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. I accused you of betraying me. I looked at you like you were a whore. I let you cry alone in that bedroom while I sat in my study and planned how to destroy you if the test came back negative. His voice cracked. How do I come back from that? By apologizing. Elias reached out and covered Dante's hands with his own. By holding me. By telling me you believe me now. That's not enough. It's a start. Elias stepped closer, until his body was pressed against Dante's chest. I'm not asking for perfection, Dante. I'm asking for you. The man who held me after my nightmares. The man who kissed my scars and told me I was safe. That man is still in there. I know he is. Dante's hands slid from the car and wrapped around Elias's waist, pulling him close. His grip was desperate, almost painful. I'm sorry, he whispered against Elias's hair. I'm so sorry. Elias closed his eyes and let himself be held. I know. I forgive you. You shouldn't. Probably not. But I love you. And I need you. All 3 of you. Elias pulled back just enough to look up at Dante's face. The test proved I was telling the truth. Now I need you to prove that you love me enough to fix this. Dante's thumb traced the line of Elias's jaw. I will. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Good. Elias stood on his tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to Dante's mouth. The alpha's lips were warm, hesitant, like he was afraid of breaking something precious. Because you owe me, Dante Vitali. And I intend to collect. Dante's laugh was shaky, but real. I'd expect nothing less. Later that night, Elias lay in the center of the massive bed, surrounded by the 3 men who had spent the past week pushing him away. Now they couldn't seem to stop touching him. Dante was curled around his back, his arm draped over Elias's waist. Luca was on his other side, his fingers threaded through Elias's hair. Matteo sat at the foot of the bed, his hand resting on Elias's ankle, as if he needed to be touching some part of him at all times. I was thinking, Luca said quietly. We should redo the nursery. The old one's been empty for years. Elias blinked. There's a nursery? There was supposed to be. Matteo's voice was low. Before the attack, we had plans. Rooms, names, the whole thing. But after we found out we were sterile, we shut it down. It was too painful. Elias's heart ached. I didn't know. We didn't want you to know. We didn't want you to think you were missing out on something we couldn't give you. Dante's arm tightened around his waist. But now you can have it. We can give you a child. Our child. Your child, Elias corrected gently. Dante's. I know the other 2 of you might feel. Don't, Luca said sharply. Don't you dare think this baby is any less ours. We're all your alphas. We're all going to be fathers. Blood doesn't matter. Matteo nodded. What he said. Elias felt tears prick at his eyes again. Damn pregnancy hormones. I love you all so much. We know. Luca leaned over and pressed a kiss to his forehead. Now get some sleep. You're growing a human. Elias laughed, and for the first time in a week, it felt genuine. He closed his eyes, safe in the arms of his 3 monsters, and let sleep take him. 2 weeks passed. The morning sickness began to ease, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made Elias want to sleep 12 hours a day. The alphas doted on him, bringing him tea and toast, rubbing his feet, reading to him in the evenings. The tension from before had faded, replaced by a cautious, fragile peace. But Elias knew better than to let his guard down. They lived in a world of violence, and violence had a way of finding them. It found them on a Tuesday. Elias was in the kitchen, attempting to make himself a sandwich, when the first shot rang out. He dropped the knife, heart pounding. More shots followed, rapid and close. Glass shattered somewhere in the house. Then Dante was there, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him toward the basement. Come on. Now. What's happening? Elias stumbled after him, his free hand pressed to his stomach. Moretti's men. They found out about the pregnancy. Dante's voice was calm, but his grip was like iron. They want to kill you before the child is born. Elias's blood ran cold. The Moretti family had been the Vitali's rivals for decades. They had been responsible for the biological attack that had nearly destroyed the 3 alphas. And now, apparently, they wanted to finish the job. Dante shoved him through the basement door. Stay here. Lock the door. Don't come out until one of us comes for you. Dante, Elias grabbed his arm. Don't leave me. I have to. Luca and Matteo are already outside. Dante cupped his face in both hands, his blue eyes burning. Listen to me, Elias. You are the most important thing in this world right now. You and that baby. I will come back for you. I swear it. He kissed Elias hard, brief and desperate. Then he was gone, closing the door behind him. Elias locked it with shaking hands and sank to the floor. The gunfire continued, muffled now by the thick walls. He pressed his hands over his ears and tried to breathe. He didn't know how long he sat there. Minutes, maybe hours. The sounds of fighting faded, then stopped. The silence was worse. Then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Coming down the stairs. Elias? It was Matteo's voice. Elias scrambled to his feet and unlocked the door. Matteo stood on the other side, covered in blood, some of it his own. His lip was split, his knuckles raw, but he was alive. "It's over," he said. "We drove them off. But they'll be back." Elias threw his arms around him, ignoring the blood. "Are you hurt?" "Where are Dante and Luca?" "Dante's fine. Luca took a bullet to the arm, but he'll live." Matteo held him close, his massive arms like iron bands. "You're okay? The baby?" "We're okay." Elias buried his face in Matteo's chest. "I was so scared." "I know." Matteo kissed the top of his head. "I'm sorry we couldn't keep you out of it." They found Dante in the study, standing over a map of the estate. His black shirt was torn, his face smeared with dirt and blood. Luca sat in a chair nearby, his left arm bandaged and his green eyes blazing with fury. "They knew," Dante said when Elias walked in. "They knew about the pregnancy before we even told anyone. Someone in this house is a traitor." Elias felt the floor tilt. "What? Who?" "I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out." Dante's jaw tightened. "And when I do, I'm going to make them suffer." Luca rose from the chair, wincing. "We need to move you. Somewhere safe. We have a property upstate, it's secure, off the grid. You and the baby will be protected there." "No," Elias shook his head. "I'm not leaving you three here to fight alone." "This isn't a negotiation," Dante said. "You're pregnant, Elias. You can't be here if they attack again. I won't risk you. And I won't let you lock me away like a coward." Elias crossed his arms, glaring. "I'm not a piece of property. I'm not a liability. I'm your Omega, and I belong at your side." The three alphas exchanged glances. For a moment, Elias thought they might argue. But then Luca sighed, a small, reluctant smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You're going to be the death of us, you know that?" Luca walked over and pulled Elias into his arms, careful of his injured shoulder. "Fine. You stay. But you don't leave this house without at least two of us with you. Understand?" Elias relaxed into his embrace. "Understand." "Stubborn," Matteo muttered, but there was affection in his voice. "I can't believe I'm going to be a father to a child just as stubborn as you." Dante's hand landed on the back of Elias's neck, warm and steady. "We'll find the traitor. We'll protect you. And when this is over, I'm going to burn the Moretti family to the ground." Elias shivered. Not from fear, but from something else. Something dark and hungry. He was surrounded by monsters, and he was carrying their child. For the first time in his life, he realized he wouldn't have it any other way. Finding the traitor took 3 days. It was Luca who uncovered the truth, piecing together phone records and security footage until the picture became clear. The traitor was a man named Victor Hale. The household manager. The man who had called Dr. Chen the morning Elias first started throwing up. "He's been feeding information to the Moretti family for years," Luca said, tossing a folder onto the desk. "That's how they found out about the biological attack before it happened. They knew we'd survive, but they wanted us sterile. They wanted the bloodline to end." Elias sat on the couch, his hand resting on the small swell of his stomach. 3.5 months along now. The bump was barely visible under his clothes, but it was there. His baby. Dante's baby. Their baby. "Where is he now?" Dante asked, his voice like ice. "He tried to run last night. Our men caught him trying to cross the Canadian border." Luca's green eyes glittered. "He's in the basement. Awaiting your orders." Dante stood. "I'll deal with him myself." "Dante." Elias rose too. "Let me come with you." No. Please. Elias walked over and took Dante's hand. I need to hear it from him. I need to know why he did it. He was in our house. He served us tea. He asked about my health. His voice trembled. I trusted him. Dante's expression softened, just a fraction. Fine. But if it gets too much, you leave. No arguments. No arguments, Elias agreed. The basement was cold and dark, lit by a single bare bulb swinging from the ceiling. Victor Hale sat tied to a chair, his silver hair disheveled, his face bruised. He had been beaten, but not enough to break. Not yet. Dante circled him slowly, like a shark. You've been with this family for 20 years, Victor. I gave you everything. Money, protection, respect. And this is how you repay me? Hale lifted his head. His eyes were glassy, but there was no remorse in them. I did what I had to do. The Moretti family pays better than you ever did. And they promised me something you could never give me. What's that? Luca asked from the shadows. Power. Hale's lips twisted into a bitter smile. I'm an Omega too, you know. But I never had the luxury of being coddled like your little pet over there. I worked for everything I have. And I deserved more than being a servant in your house. Elias flinched. I was never coddled. I was never a pet. Hale laughed, a harsh, rattling sound. You were. You are. 3 alphas fawning over you, marking you, breeding you. It's disgusting. If I can't have that kind of power, then no one should. Matteo stepped forward, his face dark. You helped the Moretti family attack us. You helped them try to destroy our bloodline. And now you've helped them try to kill our Omega and our unborn child. I'd do it again, Hale spat. Dante stopped circling. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, the blade gleaming in the dim light. No. You won't. He moved so fast Elias barely saw it. The knife flashed. Hale screamed. Blood sprayed across the concrete floor. Elias turned away, his stomach lurching. He pressed his hand to his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. Dante looked up, his blue eyes cold but concerned. Take him upstairs. He doesn't need to see this. Luca was at Elias's side in an instant, wrapping an arm around his shoulders and guiding him toward the stairs. Come on. Let's get you out of here. Elias let himself be led. He could hear Hale's screams behind him, echoing off the walls. A part of him wanted to feel sorry for the man. But a bigger part, the part that was carrying a child, the part that had been betrayed by someone he trusted, felt nothing at all. That night, Elias lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Dante was in the shower, washing the blood from his hands. Luca and Matteo were downstairs, cleaning up the mess. He could hear their voices through the floor, low and urgent. He rolled onto his side, one hand resting on his stomach. You're going to be born into a world of violence, he whispered to the baby. But you're also going to be born into a world of love. So much love. I promise you that. The door opened. Dante walked in, his dark hair damp, a towel around his waist. He climbed into bed and pulled Elias against his chest, his arms wrapping around him from behind. I'm sorry you had to see that, Dante murmured against his hair. I asked to go. I know. But I should have protected you from it. Dante's hand slid down to cover Elias's, both of them resting on the small swell. I should have protected you from all of it. From the moment we found out, I've been failing you. Elias turned in his arms, facing him. You haven't failed me. You were scared. You were hurt. You made a mistake. But you're here now. That's what matters. Dante kissed him, slow and deep. There was no urgency, no heat, just closeness, just comfort. When they pulled apart, Elias rested his forehead against Dante's. I love you, Elias whispered. All of you. Even when you're insufferable. Dante's laugh was soft. I love you too. We all do. More than we ever thought possible. They fell asleep like that, tangled together in the darkness, while the house settled around them and the baby grew, safe and warm. The days turned into weeks. The danger from the Moretti family faded into the background, replaced by the quiet rhythm of preparing for a child. Elias's morning sickness was gone, but he was still exhausted all the time. His stomach had begun to swell, just enough to make his clothes feel tight. At 18 weeks, they went for the anatomy scan. The ultrasound room was bright and cold. Elias lay on the exam table, his shirt pulled up, while Dr. Chen spread cold gel over his belly. The three alphas crowded around the bed, their faces a mixture of anxiety and awe. There we go, Dr. Chen said, pointing at the screen. There's the heartbeat. Strong and steady. Elias turned his head to look. The image on the screen was grainy, but he could see the tiny shape of a baby, curled up and perfect. His heart swelled. Can you tell the sex? Luca asked, leaning forward. Dr. Chen moved the wand. It looks like a boy. Congratulations. A boy. Elias closed his eyes, letting the tears come. A son. They were going to have a son. Dante's hand found his, squeezing tight. Matteo rested his hand on Elias's shoulder. Luca pressed a kiss to the side of his head. They were all touching him, all connected to him and to the baby, into each other. It was overwhelming, in the best possible way. He's beautiful, Elias whispered. He's perfect, Dante agreed. His voice was thick with emotion, something Elias rarely heard from him. Like his father. Elias opened his eyes and smirked. Which one? Luca barked a laugh. Matteo grinned. Even Dante's lips twitched. All of us, Dante said. He's going to be perfect like all of us. Dr. Chen printed out several copies of the ultrasound image. Elias held one to his chest, staring at the tiny face, the tiny hands, the tiny feet. His son. Their son. As they left the clinic, Dante kept his arm around Elias's waist, his hand splayed over the swell of his stomach. Luca walked on his other side, carrying the envelope of ultrasound photos. Matteo brought up the rear, his eyes scanning the parking lot for threats. For the first time in months, Elias felt truly safe. That evening, they sat in the living room, the ultrasound photos spread out on the coffee table. The fire crackled in the fireplace. Outside, snow was beginning to fall. We should start thinking about names, Luca said. Something strong. Something worthy of a Vitali heir. Elias leaned back against Matteo's chest, the alpha's arm wrapped around him. What about Dante Jr.? Dante choked on his wine. Absolutely not. Why not? It's traditional. It's pretentious. Dante set his glass down. Our son is going to be his own man. He doesn't need my name hanging over his head. Luca grinned. What about Luca Jr.? Also no, Dante and Matteo said in unison. Elias laughed. Okay, what about something Italian? We could honor your heritage. They spent the next hour tossing around names, Alessandro, Marco, Giovanni, Dominic. None of them felt quite right. Finally, Matteo spoke up. What about Nico? The room went quiet. Elias turned to look at him. Nico? It means victory of the people. Matteo shrugged, his amber eyes soft. I've always liked it. Elias smiled. Nico. Nico Vitali. I like it. Dante nodded slowly. Nico it is. Luca reached over and clapped Matteo on the shoulder. Look at you, getting all sentimental. I didn't know you had it in you. Matteo rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. Shut up. Elias leaned back and closed his eyes, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the men he loved. Nico. His son. Their son. The name felt right. He could almost see him now, a little boy with dark hair and gray eyes, running through the mansion, laughing. The thought made his heart ache with a fierce, protective love. We're going to be a family, he thought. A real family. And for the first time in his life, he believed it. But peace never lasted long in their world. 3 weeks later, when Elias was 21 weeks along, the Moretti family made their move. It happened in the middle of the night. Elias woke to the sound of breaking glass and shouting. He sat up, heart pounding, his hand flying to his stomach. The baby kicked, a tiny flutter that reminded him he wasn't alone. Stay here, Dante ordered, already out of bed and reaching for the gun on the nightstand. Lock the door. Don't move until we come back. Dante, no, Elias grabbed his arm. Don't leave me again. Please. Dante paused, his blue eyes softening. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to Elias's forehead. I'll come back. I promise. But I need you to be safe. For me. For Nico. Elias's grip tightened. You can't keep doing this. You can't keep running into danger while I sit here and wait. I know. But right now, it's the only way. Dante pulled free, his jaw set. I love you. I'll be back. Then he was gone, closing the door behind him. Elias sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of fighting. Gunshots. Shouts. The thud of bodies hitting walls. He wanted to be out there with them, fighting alongside them. But he was pregnant, and he had a baby to protect. So he stayed in the room, his back against the headboard, his hands resting on his stomach. The baby kicked again. I'm here, Elias thought. I'm not going anywhere. The fighting lasted for what felt like hours. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Elias held his breath. Then footsteps, running up the stairs. The door burst open. It was Luca. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his green eyes wild. We have to go. They're inside the house. We can't hold them off. Elias scrambled out of bed. Where are Dante and Matteo? Fighting in the east wing. They'll meet us at the cars. Luca grabbed his hand and pulled him into the hall. Come on. Stay low. They ran through the dark house, ducking behind furniture, dodging bullets. Elias's lungs burned. His legs ached. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. They made it to the garage. Matteo was already there, the engine running. Dante appeared a moment later, his shirt soaked with blood, not his own. Get in, Dante barked. They piled into the SUV. Matteo hit the gas, and they tore out of the driveway, leaving the mansion behind. In the rearview mirror, Elias saw flames rising from the east wing. They'll pay for this, Dante said, his voice cold. I'll make every single one of them pay. Elias leaned against Luca's side, shaking. What about the estate? Our home? It's just a house, Matteo said quietly. We can rebuild. What matters is that you're safe. You and the baby. Dante turned in his seat, his blue eyes intense. Are you hurt? Is the baby okay? Elias shook his head. We're fine. Just scared. I know. Dante reached back and squeezed his knee. I'm sorry. This is my fault. I should have seen this coming. You can't blame yourself, Elias said. The Moretti family has been trying to destroy you for years. This isn't new. No. But I should have protected you better. Dante's voice broke. I should have sent you to the safe house when I had the chance. Elias put his hand on top of Dante's. I'm not leaving you. Not now, not ever. We're in this together. Luca pressed a kiss to his temple. He's right. We're a family. Families fight together. Matteo nodded, his eyes on the road. And families win together. Elias closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the car soothe him. The baby was still kicking, a constant reminder that life went on, even in the midst of chaos. He was carrying the future of the Vitali family inside him. And he would do whatever it took to protect it. They spent the night at a safe house in Queens, a nondescript brownstone with reinforced windows and a basement armory. Elias slept fitfully, curled up in a small bed with Luca's arms around him. Dante and Matteo took turns keeping watch. The next morning, they gathered in the kitchen. The atmosphere was tense, charged with unspoken anger. "We need to end this," Dante said. "For good. The Moretti family won't stop until we're all dead, or until they are." Luca nodded. "I've been thinking. We know their main compound is in Staten Island. If we hit them tonight, we can take out their leadership in one strike." "That's risky," Matteo said. "They'll be expecting a counterattack." "Good. Let them expect it." Dante's smile was cold. "It won't save them." Elias listened, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. He hated this. Hated the violence, the killing, the constant fear. But he understood. The Moretti family had tried to kill him and his baby. They had burned his home. They had left him with no choice. "I want to help," Elias said quietly. 3 pairs of eyes turned to him. "Absolutely not," Dante said. "I'm not asking to fight. But I can be useful. I know their compound. I grew up in Staten Island. I know the streets, the alleys, the weak points." Dante shook his head. "It's too dangerous. You're pregnant, Elias. I won't risk you." "I'm not asking you to risk me. I'm asking you to let me contribute." Elias met his eyes steadily. "I'm not just your Omega. I'm your partner. Let me act like it." There was a long silence. Then Luca sighed. "He has a point. He knows the area better than any of us. We can use him as a guide," Matteo added. "He doesn't have to go in. He can stay in the van, coordinate the attack." Dante's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to argue. But finally, he nodded. "Fine. But you stay in the van. No exceptions." "No exceptions," Elias agreed. The attack was planned for 2 a.m., when the Moretti compound would be at its most vulnerable. Elias sat in the back of a black surveillance van, a laptop open in front of him. The screen showed a live feed from the body cameras worn by Dante, Luca, and Matteo. "East entrance is clear," Dante's voice crackled through the radio. 2 guards down. Moving inside." Elias watched the feed, his heart pounding. The men moved through the compound like ghosts, silent and deadly. He could see the tension in their bodies, the way they communicated with hand signals and glances. They had done this before, hundreds of times. But this time was different. This time, they were fighting for him. For their son. "West wing secured," Luca reported. "No sign of Moretti yet." "He's in the basement," Elias said into the radio. "There's a panic room down there. He'll be locked in." "How do you know that?" Matteo asked. "I did my research." Elias zoomed in on the blueprints on his laptop. "There's a ventilation shaft that leads to the panic room. It's too small for any of you, but I could fit through it." "No," Dante said immediately. "You're not going in there." "I'm not saying I will. I'm just saying it exists." Elias smiled, even though they couldn't see him. "But if you need a backup plan, it's there." Dante muttered something under his breath. "Stay in the van." "That's an order." Elias rolled his eyes. "Yes, sir." The mission continued. Elias guided them through the compound, using the blueprints and security feeds to warn them of threats. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. He felt useful. He felt like part of the team. Then, suddenly, everything went wrong. "Ambush!" Luca shouted. Gunfire erupted through the radio. Elias's screen went dark as one of the body cameras was destroyed. "Luca?" Elias's voice cracked. Luca, can you hear me? Static. Then Dante's voice, strained. We're pinned down. East corridor. They knew we were coming. Elias's blood ran cold. They had walked into a trap. The Moretti family had been waiting for them. He looked at the blueprints, his mind racing. There had to be another way out. Another exit. Another something. Then he saw it. The ventilation shaft he had mentioned earlier. It led not just to the panic room, but to the east corridor. It was tight, but he could fit. I'm going in, Elias said, already opening the van door. Like hell you are, Dante snarled. Stay where you are. I'm the only one who can fit through that shaft. I can get behind them and open a door or create a distraction. Elias's voice was calm, even though his hands were shaking. Trust me. I can do this. There was a long pause. Then Luca's voice, weak but steady, led him. We're running out of time. Dante cursed. Fine. But if anything happens to you, Elias, I swear to God. I know. Elias grabbed a gun from the van's armory and checked the magazine. I love you all. I'll be careful. He slipped out of the van and into the night, his heart pounding, his baby fluttering in his stomach. He was terrified. But he was also determined. He would not let his family die. Not tonight. The ventilation shaft was as tight as Elias had expected. He crawled through it on his stomach, the metal pressing in on all sides. The gun was strapped to his back, digging into his spine. His belly, now visibly pregnant, scraped against the floor. But he kept moving. Inch by inch, foot by foot. He could hear the gunfire growing louder, the shouts of the Moretti men, the grunts of his alphas. Then he saw it, a grate in the floor, below which the east corridor stretched out. He could see the Moretti men taking cover behind overturned tables, firing at the doorway where Dante, Luca, and Matteo were pinned down. Elias took a deep breath. Then he kicked the grate open and dropped into the corridor behind the enemy. The Moretti men didn't see him at first. They were too focused on the doorway. Elias raised his gun and fired. The first bullet took out a man in a black suit. The second hit another in the leg. The third missed, but it didn't matter, the element of surprise was enough. Dante and the others emerged from the doorway, guns blazing. The Moretti men were caught in the crossfire, cut down before they could react. In less than 30 seconds, it was over. Elias stood in the middle of the corridor, his chest heaving, his gun still raised. Blood spattered the walls. Bodies lay at his feet. He had never killed anyone before. He had never even fired a gun outside a shooting range. But he had done it. For them. For his family. Dante was at his side in an instant, grabbing him, pulling him close. You idiot. You absolute idiot. I saved your life, Elias said, his voice shaking. You could have been killed. Dante's arms tightened around him. Don't ever do that again. Please. I can't lose you. Luca and Matteo joined the embrace, forming a protective wall around Elias. They were all bleeding, all exhausted, but they were alive. And they were together. Let's go home, Matteo said quietly. Elias nodded against Dante's chest. Let's go home. The Moretti family was destroyed. Their compound was burned to the ground. Their leadership was dead or scattered. The war that had raged for 3 years was finally over. But victory came at a cost. The mansion was gone. 4 of their men were dead. And Elias was now a killer. He didn't sleep well for weeks after that. He would wake in the middle of the night, gasping, his hands reaching for a gun that wasn't there. The alphas would hold him, soothe him, whisper reassurances in the dark. But the nightmares didn't stop. It's normal, Dr. Chen said during one of their prenatal appointments. Post-traumatic stress is common after a violent event. Especially for someone who was pregnant at the time. Elias sat on the exam table, his hands resting on his growing belly. He was 26 weeks along now. The baby was moving constantly, a reassuring presence. Will it get better? In time. With support. Dr. Chen smiled gently. The fact that you have 3 very devoted partners helps. Elias laughed despite himself. They're a lot. They love you. That's what matters. They did. They brought him tea and rubbed his feet and read to him at night. They talked to his belly, telling Nico about the world he would be born into, the good parts and the bad. They held him when he cried and made him laugh when he forgot how. Slowly, the nightmares began to fade. They bought a new house, a smaller, more private estate in Connecticut. It didn't have the grandeur of the old mansion, but it had something better, a nursery, already painted in soft gray and blue. Elias stood in the doorway of the nursery one afternoon, watching Dante assemble a crib. The alpha was shirtless, his muscles flexing as he worked. It was a strangely domestic scene, one that made Elias's heart ache with love. You're staring, Dante said without looking up. I'm admiring, Elias corrected. There's a difference. Dante's lips twitched. Come here. Elias walked over, his belly now large enough to make him waddle. Dante stood and pulled him close, one hand settling on the swell. How are you feeling? Dante asked. Tired. Heavy. Happy. Elias leaned his head against Dante's shoulder. Really, really happy. Good. That's all I want. For you and Nico to be happy. Elias looked up at him. What about you? Are you happy? Dante was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I never thought I could have this. A child. A family. I thought the Moretti family had taken that from me forever. But then you came along, and you gave it back to me. He pressed a kiss to Elias's hair. I'm happier than I've ever been. Elias's eyes burned. You deserve it. All of you. You're good men, even if you don't always believe it. Dante's arms tightened around him. We're trying. For you. For Nico. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other, while the crib sat half-assembled in the corner and the future stretched out before them. At 30 weeks, Luca and Matteo insisted on throwing Elias a baby shower. It's tradition, Luca said, as if that explained everything. It's unnecessary, Elias argued. We're in the middle of a war with the Moretti family. Wait, no, that's over. But still. It's weird. It's not weird. It's festive. Matteo crossed his arms. And you're not getting out of it. So Elias found himself standing in the newly decorated living room of their Connecticut estate, surrounded by a small group of their closest allies. There was cake, and punch, and an obscene number of gifts wrapped in pastel paper. You look miserable, Dante murmured, sliding up beside him. I'm pregnant. I'm always miserable. That's not true. You smiled 3 times last week. Elias glared at him. You're not funny. Dante smirked. I'm hilarious. The shower was, against all odds, enjoyable. Elias opened gifts, tiny clothes, soft blankets, a ridiculous stuffed bear that was almost as big as he was. Luca made a speech about family and loyalty. Matteo got embarrassingly emotional over a pair of baby booties. Elias sat back and watched them, his 3 fearsome alphas reduced to gooey, sentimental fools over a baby who hadn't even been born yet. It was ridiculous. It was beautiful. It was exactly what he had always wanted. We should take a picture, someone suggested. They all crowded together on the couch, Dante, Luca, and Matteo on either side of Elias, their hands resting on his belly. Elias laughed as Luca made a face. Matteo tried to look serious but failed. Dante just stared at the camera with his usual intensity. The photo would later become Elias's favorite. It captured the 5 of them, 4 men and 1 unborn baby, in a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. It was proof that they were a family, despite everything. That night, Elias lay in bed, too tired to move. The baby shower had worn him out. His back ached. His feet were swollen. But he was happy. Luca sat beside him, rubbing lotion into his feet. Matteo was propped against the headboard, reading a pregnancy book out loud in his deep, rumbling voice. Dante was in the bathroom, running a bath. "This is nice," Elias murmured. "I could get used to this." "You'd better," Luca said. "You've got at least 10 more weeks of this. Then you get to deal with a newborn." Elias groaned. "Don't remind me." "You'll be a great father," Matteo said, looking up from the book. "We all will. We'll take shifts. We'll learn. We'll make mistakes, but we'll figure it out." Elias smiled. "Together." "Together," Luca echoed. Dante appeared in the doorway, steam billowing around him. "Bath's ready. Do you want me to carry you?" "I'm not an invalid," Elias grumbled, but he let Dante help him up anyway. The 3 alphas guided him to the bathroom, where a deep tub full of warm water and lavender bubbles awaited. Elias sank into it with a sigh of pure bliss. The baby kicked, as if approving. "This baby is going to be so spoiled," Luca said, sitting on the edge of the tub. "Like his father," Dante said, smirking. Elias splashed water at him. Rude. But he was smiling. And as he soaked in the warmth, surrounded by the men he loved, he knew that everything, every struggle, every tear, every moment of doubt, had been worth it. The contractions started at 3 a.m. on a cold February morning. Elias woke with a gasp, his hand flying to his stomach. The pain was sharp, radiating through his lower back. He had been having Braxton Hicks contractions for weeks, but this was different. This was real. "Dante," he said, his voice tight. Dante was awake in an instant. "What is it? Are you okay?" I think the baby's coming." The room exploded into motion. Luca grabbed the hospital bag. Matteo ran to pull the car around. Dante helped Elias out of bed, his hands steady but his eyes wide with panic. "Breathe," Dante said. "Just breathe." Elias wanted to punch him. "I am breathing. Now get me to the hospital before this baby decides to come out here." The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear and excitement. Elias gripped Luca's hand so hard he left bruises. Matteo ran every red light. Dante kept up a constant stream of reassurances from the front seat, though his voice cracked on every other word. They made it. Barely. Elias was wheeled into a private delivery suite, where a team of doctors and nurses was already waiting. The 3 alphas were allowed to stay, hovering at his bedside like anxious shadows. The labor was long and brutal. Elias screamed. He cried. He cursed all 3 of them and their stupid, fertile sperm. They took it all, holding his hands and wiping his brow and telling him he was doing great. And then, at 4:47 p.m., Nico Vitali was born. He was small and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. When the nurse placed him in Elias's arms, Elias felt something shift inside him, a love so fierce and overwhelming that it stole his breath. "Hi, baby," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Hi, Nico. I'm your daddy." The 3 alphas crowded around, their faces wet with tears. Dante touched Nico's tiny hand with one finger, his expression one of pure, unguarded awe. Luca was openly sobbing. Matteo couldn't speak, but his amber eyes were bright with emotion. "He's perfect," Dante said hoarsely. "He's ours," Luca added. "He's everything," Matteo finished. Elias looked up at them, his family, and smiled through his tears. "Thank you. For believing in me. For loving me. For giving me this." Dante leaned down and pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Thank you for making us fathers. For giving us a reason to be better." Nico gurgled, as if in agreement. The kitchen was chaos. "Dante, the pancakes are burning." "I'm handling it." You're not handling it. There's smoke. That's not smoke. That's flavor. Luca rolled his eyes and grabbed the pan from Dante's hands. Matteo was at the table, trying to convince a 3-year-old to eat his eggs. Elias stood in the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the chaos with a smile. Daddy! Nico spotted him and launched himself out of his chair, running across the kitchen with the unsteady determination of a toddler. Daddy, Papa Luca said I have to eat eggs, but I don't want eggs. Elias scooped him up, groaning under his weight. You're getting too big for this, you know. Nico giggled. I'm not big. I'm little. You're a giant. Elias pressed a kiss to his cheek. But you still have to eat your eggs. They'll make you strong like Uncle Matteo. Nico eyed Matteo suspiciously. Uncle Matteo is big. Exactly. Eggs did that. Nico thought about it. Then he nodded solemnly. Okay. I'll eat eggs. Matteo shot Elias a grateful look. Elias winked. They ate breakfast together, the 5 of them, at a table that was slightly too small and perpetually covered in crumbs. Nico chattered about his dreams and his toys and the dog he wanted but would never get. The 3 alphas listened with exaggerated interest, asking questions and laughing at all the right moments. After breakfast, Dante pulled Elias aside. I have something for you. Elias raised an eyebrow. Another gift? It's not even my birthday. It's not a gift. It's a question. Dante reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a ring, simple, elegant, with 3 small diamonds set in a band of platinum. Elias's breath caught. Dante. We've talked about this. All 3 of us. We want to make it official, not just as alphas and omega, but as husbands. As a family. Dante's blue eyes were earnest, vulnerable. Will you marry us? Elias looked past him to where Luca and Matteo stood in the doorway, watching with hopeful expressions. They had never been ones for grand gestures, but this was everything. Yes, Elias said, his voice breaking. Yes, I'll marry you. All of you. Dante slipped the ring onto his finger. Then Luca and Matteo were there, wrapping their arms around him, pressing kisses to his hair and face and hands. Nico ran over, demanding to know what was happening, and they all laughed and cried and held each other close. Outside, the snow was falling. Inside, a family was being born, not for the first time, and not for the last.